That's why I wore an extra leg today. You know, as the girl said to the sailor just got ashore, "Is that your wooden leg, or are you happy to see me?" Anyway, excuse me, I'm going to talk today about the Asian seas, and we've already had a great journey across the Pacific, and now we're turning up into the Tasman Sea. And in spite of the way we've been used to it, sort of like this great vastness of the Pacific now comes to its western edges into Asia. And after many days of seeing just that, we're going to have a lot of land getting in our way. Well, someday. And Pigafetti, who was the journalist for Magellan, he wrote in his journal after they were months at sea and they didn't see any land and they didn't think they'd ever get anywhere, and he said, "No more humans will ever try to cross this ocean because it has no end." Well, the goal, of course, for Magellan and the rest of them was this: the great variegated coast of Asia going down to Indonesia, Australia, and up further Japan, up to Russia. And this is the most complicated ocean conglomerate in the world because it's so vast and also has many seas, many straits, and has such history for so many eras over conflict about on the water and in the straits. So I'm going to give you a geopolitical nautical trip from the north to the south. And it's a lot, but you can lie down and enjoy it. And we'll get there eventually. So for the first Europeans who came here, they were looking at all of these islands and seas, and they were more than bewildered. They were often lost. And without local guidance and alliances, they couldn't get through this whole area. But it's come down to the present where there's still territorial disputes all through Asia over the seas and who controls the waters. And this is now governed by what they call the UNCLOS, the UN Law of the Sea, which many have signed on, some have not ratified. Particularly that red thing in North America does not agree to many international agreements these days. So it was signed in actually by the Bush administration, but has never been ratified by the Senate in the United States. But meanwhile, the basic law of it is that every nation has their shore, their internal waters, the contiguous zone, which is 12 nautical miles out, and an exclusive economic zone for another 200 miles, mainly for fishing. These laws developed over time. It used to be a 3-mile water limit. It was the range of a cannon from a fort to shore. Now it's out 200 miles for the rights, but that means almost every maritime nation in Asia has overlapping claims and disputes over things. And then, of course, you get the international waters, which are the least policed of all, and a lot of trouble is out there. I'm going to start just by going far north to the Bering Sea, and you can see in the middle of this you have the donut hole, it's called, which is international waters 200 miles off the Alaskan and Siberian coast. That's where there's intensive international fleets of fishermen go, but they cannot fish the great stocks further up there because they are territorial waters of United States and Russia. And of course the Bering Strait, if you've ever been through it, I believe the ship has been through it, is one of the more dramatic passages. It's only about 100 sea miles across with these islands in the middle, and then depending on the season has this great ice flow through and tremendous whale passages at different times. This is the rock Diomede, which is a fairway rock right in the middle of it. That's Alaskan territory. But of course this is a very big news that the Arctic is melting, and the Russians are planning and developing an entire transport fleet to go on the Northeast Passage from Europe and come down to Japan and Asia, which is approximately a half the distance by sea. But of course it's rough conditions. They would have to have icebreakers and facilities up that far. Meanwhile, the Russians have laid a territorial claim on the Lomontov Ridge, it's called, and now have claimed the North Pole as Russian territorial waters, to the point where they put a submarine down, planted metal Russian flags down on the bottom of the North Pole Sea below the ice. So this sort of brings up the whole scare of the Cold War and the conflict in the Arctic. But it has a lot of economic consequences if that happens, the passage. Or this is a former proposal back when things were a little friendlier, let's say, to have a large rail and road link across the Bering Sea that would make a land bridge to Asia and develop all the way down to China and across Russia. And even the Russians have planned to have a major highway transport system north of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. But the problem is all that permafrost is now melting, and so what was hard frozen ground is now turning into the great sea of mud that's up there now. Well, I don't think that'll happen actually, but now I'm going to just come back down to the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. You may have taken the trip out to between Japan and Alaska, British Columbia, and these are that string of volcanic islands that stretch out 1,500 sea miles, and they were, of course, in a theater of war, World War II. That was the only American territory that the Japanese actually took, and then there were battles on Attu Island to return it and drive the Japanese away. Nowadays, the battle is about fishing, and again, there you have that international, the donut in the red outline there, and then you have rich stocks of all this salmon, pollock, various things. And so the Russians on their side in Siberia and Kamchatka are equally opposed to the international fishing fleets coming and depleting all that. So if you've ever been to Petropavlovsk, it's a military naval base that's on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a very deep harbor where you get the Navy in and out of there. And but it's sort of the true end of the world for Russia. But nonetheless, they've had in recent years a lot of cooperation between the Coast Guard. So this is a meeting of the Russian Coast Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard who patrol all those waters. A rare sign of cooperation these days, I'm sorry to say. Then we're going to go down the coast from Kamchatka into the Sea of Okhotsk. And this very vast, shallow sea, it's bigger than the Mediterranean, but it's almost always icebound. And there are a few ports in it. In the summertime, they have some transit, but it is one of the least populated parts of the world, mainly because of just the icy conditions up there and the distance from everything. But there is transit down there, and then they'll go down to Vladivostok, which is on the southern coast, a bit more easily accessible from the Sea of Japan. It's right across the sea from Hokkaido here. That's Vladivostok's right about there. That's the Okhotsk Sea, and then the Kuril Islands, Hokkaido, Honshu, and the rest of Japan. That's Kamchatka up there. So this is a very big place with a dramatic sea above all the earthquake zone and all these volcanic islands which have been among the most active on the Pacific Ring of Fire, making many of them uninhabitable. There's mainly, again, the dispute over fishing, because the Japanese nation for many centuries has always considered those their fishing grounds, and they have had disputes with Russia often about who is in charge of which point of the island. It's still a subject of dispute to this day, and primary reason why the Japanese and the Russians have never signed a peace treaty in World War II, because the Japanese were, after a battle, they took many of the islands, and Sakhalin Island had joint custody of it for a number of years. But this is up in far northern Japan. This is Hokkaido. And Japan, of course, is an island nation with all these straits and passages. You have the Tartar Strait, the La Perouse Strait, the Tsugaru Strait, Tsushima Strait, and the internal waters of Japan. So this is, let's say, perhaps the most maritime nation by geography. And it had a fleet of fishing vessels, and then modernized in recent times. This was my long-distance cousin, Matthew Perry, of which I have my middle name still, who then forcibly opened Japan to trade, and then began the Meiji era and the modernization of Japan with particularly a building of a modern navy, including this is the first ironclad ship that was built in Japan. And at the time of the turn of the century, 1904, the Russian fleet was in Luda, or Port Arthur, now called Dalian, China, this bay, and it was resting at anchor when, including the flagship ship of the Russian Pacific Navy were there, when they were attacked. And that ship was bombed and sunk, and at the death of Admiral Makarov. And then the Admiral Rorochinsky led a fleet from St. Petersburg all the way around through the Suez Canal, the most strategic of straits, of course, in the Middle East. And then they expected to teach the Japanese a lesson by the power of the Tsarist fleet. But this fleet was monitored as it went slowly around the world with its black fumes of coal, which meant it was very easy to keep an eye on it. And so finally it met in the Korean Strait, or the Tsushima Strait, where the Japanese fleet was waiting with torpedo boats to go and attack the Russian fleet. And this was a complete victory for the Japanese. They had these modern fast speedboats that just sank one after the other of the capital ships of the Russian Navy. At the time, Admiral Toko Hichiro was the leader of the Japanese fleet and commanding from the ship the Misaka. But when the Russian fleet was so sunk, they went and saved many of the sailors, including the Admiral Roroshevsky, and this is their meeting in Togo, visited him in the hospital. Well, that ship is still in Hiroshima, the Mikasa, and historic ship from that time. There was a peace brokered with President Teddy Roosevelt to make peace between these two nations. And so for many years up to World War II, the Japanese took all the Kuril Islands and half of Sakhalin. Well, I'm going to keep going down the coast. This is a big place, so I'll just go to the next trouble, which is Korea. Now, this was an ancient kingdom with a Confucian leadership, scholarship. This is the man who invented the Hangul, the Korean writing to replace Chinese characters. And then in the 20th century, this was the first emperor, Li, in the capital of Pyongyang. And this was a very simple, let's say, economy back then, but because China and Japan had both been opened up for international trade forcibly, a patrol from Shanghai of the U.S. Navy decided to go visit Korean capital and go up the Pyongyang River. And so the General Sherman came up in 1866, and then the Korean Navy and militia fought it back and burned it. Now, this is a romantic painting with Kim Il-sung's supposed grandfather leading the attack on the General Sherman and destroying the American invasion of the time. So this is where everybody gets their own bit of history in Asia. And then the United States was a bit angry about that, and so they sent in a force. And of course, the Koreans were, let's say, a medieval kind of a navy and military, but the United States come and took a hill called Gwanghwa, 1871, and forced an agreement of the Koreans to open up. Here's the battle flag that was won and now is in storage at the U.S. Naval Academy. And on the other hand, the Japanese, in their need for land and resources, were encouraged by President Teddy Roosevelt to take Korea, and that began the colonization of Korea, which is still painful to this day in a sense, but it also was part of the Korean history that the North Koreans got even more revenge by taking the U.S. Pueblo, a reconnaissance ship that is still in the river in Pyongyang to this day. So that's the trouble of that part. Now you go over to the Bohai Sea and the China coast, you get all kinds of bays and inlets and big cities. Of course, there's Dalian and Beijing, and further down south, Qingdao to Shanghai. This is the small town of Dalian, which is a major shipbuilding center where they built the recent aircraft carriers for the Chinese Navy. But it was originally Luda, or a Russian settlement, so you'll still find Russian buildings and Russian speakers in that city. And then you go down Tianjin, the port access for Beijing. And when Teddy Roosevelt initiated the Navy reconstruction, 1908, he sent the fleet all the way around the world, what they call the Great White Fleet, to fly the flag and either make peace or make alliances wherever they went. But at the time, soon after that, the Russian Revolution created chaos in the north, and the U.S. Marines landed not only in Murmansk, they came into Vladivostok on the side of the White Russian, the Tsarist forces, to fight the communists. So this is another example of a historical incident where American troops were there maybe making peace or making more trouble in Vladivostok here in those years before World War I. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire expanded into Manchukuo and further into China, and these are portraits about how the Japanese would have an alliance with the Chinese people and the Korean people to make what they call the co-prosperity field, which of course didn't work out quite that way. But I'm going to go back to Japan because it has such a fantastic inland sea to it. This is the Seto Nakai, which goes from Osaka down through to Hiroshima, then out to Shimonoseki. But this is one of the most beautiful passages for seascape, just because once you get past the Akashi Bridge and the troubled waters there, you go into the most beautiful tranquil seas. These are the old shrimp boats that used to ply out of the western part of the Seto Nakai. You can see Honshu and Hiroshima there, and then Shimonoseki is the strait that goes out toward the East China Sea. And here's Kyushu with Nagasaki, Kagoshima, and other major ports here. This ship was built in, Nagasaki, a very beautiful port. And there's another passage, the Otsumi Strait, that's to the south, and that's where they have the space center for the Japanese space program. And if you haven't been there, Kagoshima is a beautiful town with a big volcano right in front of it. Well, anyway, this was the site of previous troubles, as I'll go on in history. When the Mongol Empire came and took the Korean Peninsula, they wanted to then take Japan with their vast forces, but they were resisted by Tojo Tokimune was considered a overwhelming odds because the Mongols had the big Chinese fleet and they had thousands more people, but there was the Kamikaze, a storm that came up, sort of like outside today, that then destroyed the fleet. And this led to the heritage of the Kamikaze, or the Holy Wind. And this was then carried on into World War II with the suicide bombers, pilots who came out of Kyushu to resist the American and Allied invasion. So that was a very pungent replay of history, but it didn't work out so well this time around. Meanwhile, the Japanese economy and imperial mandate was to control all of East Asia waters. And so when you go down from Kyushu to Okinawa, then you go down to Taiwan, that East China Sea is still a very vital area for commerce and, unfortunately, conflict. Well, here was the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, which was the bloodiest of all the terrible battles of the time. And that mostly secured the defeat of Japan and the sinking of the Yamamoto, the last capital ship. That was the end of the Japanese Navy at the time. And but still, the islands are still there. Now we have a modern conflict in the same area over the Ryukyu Islands and the what they call the Diaoyutai in Chinese, the same rocks that are actually uninhabited, but they are disputed by both nations. And in this case, Taiwan, the nationalist government there, agrees with the Beijing government that it's theirs somehow, but the Japanese Navy and Coast Guard keeps a patrol around it, and but it's one of those issues that may be a thorn in everybody's side, but it's basically just a bunch of rocks. So, but it's about fishing and national pride mostly. And I'm going to go down along the China coast by Shanghai. This is the world's largest suspension bridge, cantilevered, that crosses Hangzhou Bay. It goes for 27 kilometers, and it is a tremendous engineering feat. It was open about 8 years ago. It has a roadway that winds around so that people don't get too bored driving on. Then they have, of course, a hotel karaoke bar at the middle of the bridge for transit, and they're waging peace and prosperity there. Then I'm going to go down to Taiwan. Bear with me here. It's a long trip. And I used to work in Taiwan, and we were right across the strait, again, about 100 sea miles to the mainland of Fujian province, China. And this has been the leftover of the Chinese Civil War, where the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, and they've been there and made a society in contrast to the mainland. But the mainland has always been planning to go and reunite the motherland. Of course, the irony is that the Taiwanese people don't feel like they are part of the mainland government, especially the Beijing communist regime, and they have had development of democracy and such. So they're always talking, but the mainland, Beijing, is always threatening an invasion, except that now, 50, 70 years later, after the end of the Chinese Civil War, it's not over. But the big cities right across from each other, Xiamen and Taipei, they're among the most prosperous parts of all of Asia. So a war would be unthinkable because it would ruin everybody's economy, but still they're there ready to do it. And when I lived in Taiwan, the story was, well, if the Red Army and Navy tries to invade Taiwan, they won't be able to find it because the air pollution's too bad. And then if they get ashore and try to get into the capital cities, they'll just get stuck in a traffic jam. They'll all come out and we'll all have noodles and it's all over. But we'll see when it gets around, because the Chinese Navy has been building up its, let's say, assault forces, and Taiwan also has its defense program. And I was working and living in Taiwan and Hong Kong mainly. I've been many years in different projects there. So as a courtesy, I designed a new national flag of unity a number of years ago, and with the Hong Kong symbol, the People's Republic symbol, and the rising sun of the nationalist flag. Well, this was banned in China. It was totally confiscated, but it's an idea. It hasn't happened. Then I'm going to go down south of Taiwan is the Luzon Street, going down to the Philippines. Now that's where most of the trade for Japan and up to Kamchatka, Russia go. And this was, again, a critical strait, particularly during the, let's say, the Cold War, where you had the Russians and the Chinese versus South Korea, Japan, Philippines, and American, Australian assorted allies. And so this has somewhat flipped in our recent decades. Now the Philippines, if you've been there, is a fantastic archipelago of at least 7,000 major islands. And it has a maritime culture of fishing and transit, and so they have their exclusive economic zone. But you see on the right here, the Scarborough Reef has been occupied by the Chinese Navy, and they have been rebuffing any Filipinos from going out and fishing in their own waters. Well, again, the Philippines has a difficult tradition of invasion. Here's Manila being taken, and then as the Japanese Navy and Army kept going south, they grabbed island after land, Singapore to Java, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. And there's an interesting book called The Sea of Thunder, which is about the command and strategy of the navies at the time, because you had the great Imperial Navy of Japan, which was highly modern and disciplined and capable. And of course, it overextended itself essentially. They went so far, so fast, to maybe their own surprise, that it took a while before the Allies, and particularly the American Navy, started coming and island hopping to end this situation. But I won't go into any detail, except a lot of the battles happened in and around the Philippines and the Coral Sea, and particularly naval aviation and battles of such scale had never been seen before, particularly with the aircraft bombing ships, and this became the era of the aircraft carrier, which sort of goes on to this day. And then there were bitter land battles in Okinawa and all the Iwo Jima, and so you know these stories. It's a very painful history. My father and my grandfather were both out there in that campaign. And then, of course, the tragic end of it all was this. And so when my mother and father were young, my father's career, class of West Point, 1944, he graduated immediately, went to the front, got wounded. But my mother ended up living in Osaka, and then she lived in Yokohama. And this is what she remembers. There was nothing anywhere. And, of course, it's a miracle of revival that Japan is now what it is. I'm going to move on, though, down to Indonesia, another vast nation of islands like the Philippines, but even more vast and spread around and often far from each other, and have very distinct different cultures in many different places. And so this has been in dispute between the local peoples, the Dutch colonists, the various people who have come in, and it's a very complicated country, but a very beautiful one. This is Timor, which was broken off. The former Portuguese colony was broken off from Indonesia as one of those micronations there. This is the Torres Strait. Now we're getting to Australian waters. This is the very narrow gap between the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So if you're not going to go through the archipelago of the Philippines into the South China Sea to Singapore, you'll go down to the Torres Strait, and then you'll have a passage. But it is very narrow and very shallow. I've been through there, and I saw a major ship just run aground miles from shore just because it's so shallow and the sands are shifting. And so there's some community up there. This is the tip of Queensland, of course. And, but that's one of the more strategic passages in all of Asia. It opens up into the Arafura Sea and Darwin. And now the Indonesian government and the Australian government have agreed to some oil exploration right out there in the Arafura Sea. But again, that's the northern tip of Australia, and going back to the terrible war, this was the one place that the Japanese bombed Darwin Harbor in preparation for an invasion. This is the USS Perry that was sunk in Darwin Harbor then. And so this, all these seas have bad history. Currently, there's current disputes. Now, this is the South China Sea, and again, I've worked around and sailed all over there. I missed the Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the last hot war that was in the sea, but right now, the major commerce of Asia goes right through the Straits of Malacca up into the South China Sea and then various ports. Now, China has become a net oil energy importer, and so this was a vital strategic interest of the Chinese nation, that they feel that they can control their sea. And of course, it's a major passage for the world's economy. Some trillion US dollars of trade go through there every year, and the Japanese, Taiwanese, Chinese, Korean economies depend on that. There has been a proposal to make a new canal through the Isthmus of Kra, through above Malaysia in Thai land, and that has been debated for over 150 years and has never been built because it's actually so expensive to build that it's not as economical as just going around through Singapore. Well, what we've come to now is the claim of China on the whole South China Sea, what they call the 9-dash line. And there have been incidents with the naval ship Impeccable and many, let's say, potential flashpoints for conflict through here. But this is what the Chinese believe, that is their traditional fishing grounds, right up to the beaches of Borneo, Philippines, Vietnam. And this has recently been judged illegal as territorial claim by the International Court of the United Nations Law of the Sea in The Hague. The Chinese refused to agree with that, and now they have been, as you know, building these reefs up into hard, dry land, which makes it then a territorial claim. There are hundreds of these little islands and reefs all over through the China Sea, particularly down toward Borneo, Brunei, that area, and many of them have been claimed by the Vietnamese. The yellow star red flag, that's Vietnam. That's Taiwan. Taiwan has actually the largest naval base there on one of these islands. Others are Philippines, Malaysian, and then more and more Fiery Cross Reef, that one right there, that is one of the bigger new Chinese bases. So these fishing little atolls and beautiful shallows were prime fishing, and now they keep getting built up with more structures, supposedly for navigation, but what the Chinese have done has begun to dredge and fill and build military bases. They said they weren't going to militarize it, but that doesn't look like a casino, does it? Well, it depends on what you play with. And so then all these other islands have been turned into airstrips, harbors. And there are many. Every year there's more of this construction, and this is the major irritant in the whole area of South China Sea. The other one is the oil rigs that are being brought in internationally and off different coasts. So this has been a flashpoint in relations with Vietnam and China, because the Vietnamese consider that water in their exclusive economic zone, but then the Chinese came out and harassed the ships and had some rammings and incidents, leading to the Vietnamese people having a very bitter feeling toward their traditional enemy, the Chinese. In the South China Sea, the standoff is actually led by fishing fleets largely, and then you have the coast guards and other naval vessels standing by. But this is where it could easily turn into a major conflict, and that's why the United States and Japan and other allies go through the South China Sea, what they call freedom of navigation operations, and to show the Chinese that this is international waters, but they're always getting warned off, and occasionally ships are rammed by the different Coast Guard vessels. For the Chinese strategic view, they want their Navy to be able to defend China on that first line island chain from essentially Okinawa all the way, including Taiwan, down to the South China Sea. And then as they develop a more blue water fleet, they will be able to defend China from, I'm not sure what, out on the second island chain, which happens to include Guam and the Philippines and all these other islands that are further out. So this is the current kind of Cold War or arms race in Asia. And after all that other bad history, we hope that it doesn't blow up again, because now the damages would be tremendous. This is the new Chinese aircraft carrier launched in Dalian. But militaries are supposed to guarantee the peace, but the more that you militarize, the more likely there's going to be an incident. For instance, there are over 100 submarines operating in the South China Sea on any given day. So there's a lot of stealthing around, and it's a real question whether aircraft carriers are of any use with satellites and missilery. Now I'm going to go down the further west. This is Singapore and the Straits of Malacca and Sumatra. And this is the great pinch point of the seas in Asia, where to get to the Indian Ocean and Europe and such, everybody goes through the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. I'd worked out of there for a number of years. They say you have every true traveler eventually goes through Singapore, and every sailor goes there too, of course, eventually. But this is also an area where there's a lot of pirates, and for years we had armed patrols on the ships, and I never had a full incident of it, but we were always prepared, and this was a traditional place where there would be attacks. Here's some pirates with cannon attacking a local town in former days, and then when the European colonial powers came in, they used their navies to fight the armed fleets of pirates that infested all the South China Seas, and this used to be the way they took care of the problem. Nowadays, the pirates are just fishermen that have a day off, and they have all the tools, and they are very careful with what they take. A lot of it's been suppressed by the combined Indonesian, Malaysian, Singapore, Chinese, and other navies. But this is my favorite pirate because he's a Yankees fan. Can't be all bad. Or as the kid said to his father, "Daddy, I don't want to be a pirate." "Shut up, kid, and drink your rum." Anyway, the last strait I'm going to show you is Sunda Strait, which is in between the island of Sumatra and Java, and Jakarta is right around the corner from there. But this is another sea passage into the Indian Ocean, but it has a lot of rocks and big waters that go through there. But it also is the site of one of the battles in World War II with the Australian Navy that held the Japanese Navy out of coming in further south. The HMS Sydney was sunk and recently found off Western Australia. But the Sunda Strait actually has a much bigger problem called Krakatoa, the great volcano that blew up in 1883. And now it looks like this. It's what they call a collapsed crater. And then there's a little island in the middle called Anak Krakatoa, which means the son of Krakatoa. So there's another volcano arising. And so for all these troubles of humans and all of these waters, perhaps the biggest problem will be nature itself coming back to haunt these waters and blow up volcanoes in our face. But meanwhile, if you're interested in any more of this news about particularly the South China Sea, you can look that up. And then I leave you with a saying, "Si hai wei jia," which means in Chinese that to a sailor, all the four seas of the world are your home. And that website is for the research vessel that I command when it's on land. It's on dry dock, fortunately, now, out of a charity based in London called Ecotechnics. And that's my own private boat, the Clang 2, and my address. And come by the Ear Inn, which is the oldest sailors' pub in the little fishing town of New York. And with that, I wish you, Yifan Feng Shun, may you have a following wind and a great trip through these troubled waters and a peaceful passage. Thank you very much. Okay.